party that wins the most seats should be able to form the government.
No, we're going to always fight Conservatives because we don't believe in their cuts to services. We don't believe in how they could harm people. We're going to fight that.
We are focused on electing a strong Liberal government that is going to be able to continue the hard work.
Party leaders are in their final push to Election Day, just 4 days away now. And as that day draws closer and closer, more people are talking about the what-if scenarios because it's looking more and more like this election could result in a minority outcome. So what if no party lands a majority? Philippe Lagacé is an associate professor at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs and an expert in the Westminster parliamentary system of government. He joins us now from Ottawa. Hi, Professor. Nice to see you. Thanks for your time today.
My pleasure.
I'm hoping we can start off by helping myself and our viewers understand what the various scenarios are if no party wins enough seats to form a majority.
Sure. So in that situation, the Prime Minister on election night will probably tell us what his intentions are. If he chooses to remain in power and try to test the confidence of the House of Commons, whether he wins the most seats or not, that's his choice to do so. He'll then inform the Governor-General of his intentions. He doesn't need her permission, but he'll nonetheless keep her abreast of that. He'll then start putting together a new cabinet, a throne speech, and in all likelihood negotiating with one of the smaller parties to secure confidence when Parliament is recalled. On the other hand, if the Prime Minister decides that the Conservative Party has won the most seats and therefore he should concede defeat, he will come out and do so. That's sending a signal to the Governor-General that she should commission Andrew Scheer to be Prime Minister. He'll then go through a transition of about 2 to 3 weeks, and then he'll follow the same process. Put together a cabinet, put together a throne speech, seek to find an opposition party that's willing to support him so that he can secure confidence.
What about the idea of convention? We're hearing it talked about by Andrew Scheer, for example, who said yesterday said this morning actually, that modern convention is that a prime minister who comes out of an election with less seats resigns, or the flip side of that is whomever wins the most seats has a right to form government. We also found an interview that Justin Trudeau did back in 2015 with Peter Mansbridge in which he said essentially the same thing. Is that accurate?
I wouldn't call it a convention because conventions are constitutionally binding. So what Mr. Scheer is referring to and what others have referred to in the past is effectively our custom or tradition. It's how we typically do things, and most parties agree to follow that custom. However, that custom can be set aside if the situation warrants it. So if the Prime Minister of the day, even though they don't win the most seats, decides that for ideological reasons or looking at the composition of the House of Commons, determines that they still have the better shot at securing confidence and governing, then they have the option of doing so. The true convention here that's in play is the confidence of the House of Commons. So the right to govern is tied to whoever can secure that confidence and maintain it, not whoever has the most seats.
Where do you think the sense that we seem to hear that any attempt to govern if you're not the party with the most seats is not legitimate? What do you think the genesis of that is?
Well, I think there's a question of fair play and democratic propriety that comes into it, and certainly that custom that we have that the party with the most seats governs is going to be increasingly heavy as the margin between the two parties widens. So if we're talking about a 10, 15 seat difference, then the pressure on the Prime Minister to concede defeat if the Conservatives have the most seats is going to be pretty heavy. If, on the other hand, it's a fairly tight margin, then the weight of that custom is much lighter, and he may decide to simply stay in office and continue and attempt to secure confidence himself.
You've touched on the role of the Governor-General, but can you expand on the potential role of the Governor-General through various scenarios that might emerge if no party wins enough seats to form a majority?
Well, the Governor-General's role is actually quite circumscribed by convention. So she will not dismiss her Prime Minister if her Prime Minister tells her that he is seeking to secure confidence, even if he does not have the most seats. Her role in that instance is to encourage him to meet the Parliament and the House of Commons as quickly as possible to demonstrate that he has confidence. And in the event that either the Prime Minister or a new Prime Minister fails to secure confidence in a short period of time, so let's say 6 to 9 months, her discretion comes into play because that Prime Minister will in all likelihood request a dissolution of Parliament in another election. She then has to make the determination of whether to grant that dissolution or to seek another party leader who could form government and continue to make Parliament work. And that's really her main role and her main discretionary role in the event of a vote of non-confidence.
And how much discretion, is there some sort of convention or custom that governs the amount of discretion a Governor General in that situation might use?
Well, there are guideposts. So generally speaking, if it's been 6 months since an election, the Governor General will consider trying to find another party to make it work much more heavily. If it's been more than 6 months, in that circumstance, the Governor General might feel that it's more appropriate to allow the electorate to express itself. Similarly, if it has been less than 6 months and a group of other parties has gotten together and put together some kind of public agreement that demonstrates that they could govern or that a viable government is available, then that would weigh more in favor of declining the request for a dissolution and commissioning a new Prime Minister.
Before I let you go, you have written some very helpful pieces for people like me who are trying to cover this situation in the media, and for those of us who try to report on it. What do you think the biggest inaccuracies that are put out there are, and which are the ones that really bother you and you want to correct for the record here for all of our viewers watching?
Well, I think it is very important to be clear when not to use the term convention too loosely. Convention means something very specific. It means a binding constitutional rule, so it's at the level of constitutional importance. Other types of rules that we have out there, customs, traditions, and practices, are not binding, and they can have to be set aside when either legal reality, in this case the fact that the Prime Minister is Prime Minister until they resign or are dismissed, or true veritable conventions, such as the need to secure the confidence of the House of Commons, comes into play. So I would say that really we need to be clear and be careful when we use these terms, because they end up shaping how our Constitution operates and how people understand the legitimacy of our system.
Well, I appreciate your time and your insights very much. Thank you so much, Professor Lagasse.
Thank you.
With polls continuing to show a dead heat, Canadians could be waking up Tuesday morning to a situation where no party wins a majority and who forms government, rather, is up in the air. That's because, depending on the seat count, party leaders could wind up in a power struggle that ends in any number of ways. So how should the leaders and the parties be positioning themselves in these final few days? Let's find out from three people who know what it's like in the war room right now. David Tarrant is the former Executive Director of Strategic Communications to Ontario Premier Doug Ford. He joins us from Ottawa. Michelle Cadario was the former National Liberal Campaign Director for the 2004 election, and Brian Topp was the former National NDP Campaign Director for the 2006 and 2008 elections. Hello to all three of you. Wonderful to see you.
Hey,
I know that you're kind of all breathing a sigh of relief that you're not in the war room right now.
That's right.
Brian, why don't I start with you? Help us understand, with 4 days out, what especially in particular to this election, what you imagine might be happening behind the scenes.
Well, look, elections are 3-period hockey games, and people pay attention 3 times. They pay attention in the launch, then they watch the debates, and then a bunch of them, an important percentage, watch the close, watch the last few days. And so the trick is to not go dark in the last few days and be off repeating Gainsberger's announcements, but to say something really clear and really compelling that motivates your folks to actually come out, and that speaks to that last tiny, maybe 2 or 3 or 4% that still haven't quite made up their minds that they're going to go with you. And also hold the people who are loosely attached to you and are not 100% sure they're there and go, yes, I'm making the right call. So it's all about trying to simplify your message, trying to be crystal clear, relevant to the debate, interesting, remind people why they like you. And that's a tall order and very hard to do, but when you do it, you're rewarded.
If you look, Michelle, through that paradigm, how do you analyze the messages that you're hearing from the various parties right now? And why do you think they've kind of coalesced around this idea, whether it be positive or negative, of the possibility of a coalition?
Well, everybody's making their closing message right now. And I think that you see the leaders making very different messages out there. Mr. Scheer is clearly out there saying, I'm going to form a government. I'm going to be Prime Minister come Monday night. And so that's the reason, I guess, to vote for me. I think that Mr. Trudeau is saying that you have a choice and that we need a progressive government in Ottawa if you want to keep climate change, if you want to actually address that, if you want to have a government that's not focused solely on cuts. And so that's his closing argument, and he's got to make that across the country, and he's got to make it that the best way to do that is to vote for the person who's going to become Prime Minister and to vote for the party to become Prime Minister. Mr. Singh has kind of I think, a more difficult role because on the one hand, he's saying, listen, your vote for a progressive matters, and we want you to be, and we want your vote as a progressive, but trying to edge them away from not seeing that there's only 2 people who could be Prime Minister. And so he's kind of got the more challenging message in some ways going through the final days.
All of this seems to, David, revolve around the potential scenarios after Election Day, and that's driving a lot of the messaging over this week. Do you think that's a net positive or a net negative for the leaders?
Well, I think by now the messaging for all the parties, Vashi, has been refined over the course of the campaign. Like, there's not going to be a whole lot of changes. They know what works and what doesn't. And I think it's worth pointing out as well now there's 338 ridings. And I think as Brian and Michelle can attest, hundreds of candidates, thousands of volunteers. They should be out persuading people, identifying voters, mobilizing them to get to the polls, sitting around chewing the fat about whether or not the Prime Minister Trudeau will actually respect the result of the election. Doesn't help any of them. So what's driving this? Well, it's soap opera speculation that among people who get to follow politics for a living, like people like me. But it's also, quite frankly, being driven by the fact that Mr. Trudeau is now ruling it out. And the notion that someone can lose an election but still somehow cling to power is something that if you don't reject it, it means you're open to it. And that's concerning.
Is that, just on the idea, though, that he's not ruling out a coalition, like he's not endorsing one either, right? He's not coming out there and saying, yes, we want a coalition for sure. We're going to make sure that happens with the NDP. I take your point. That's how the Conservatives certainly have interpreted it. Does that help Mr. Scheer's cause to be out there saying, hey, Mr. Trudeau's not turning down the idea of a coalition? Do you think that helps you with your voters?
Well, I'd say this. There's many reasons that we have a pitch about how that, that a Liberal, a Trudeau NDP coalition is something that Canadians can't afford, and that, quite frankly, is something that would not be legitimate. I think the pitch he's making to Canadians is that if you actually are worried about Justin Trudeau kind of triggering some sort of constitutional crisis by not resigning after losing an election, the clear way to prevent that from happening is to take the decision out of his hands and elect the Conservative majority. And so, as a closing argument, is that actually you're not just voting for a set of policies, you're voting, quite frankly, for a more stable constitutional order. And I think that is a compelling pitch. Quite frankly, we'd be just as happy if this wasn't an issue at all, and we could spend our time talking about the various parties' pitches on affordability and who's going to help you get ahead.
Would you really? Brian, what do you think? This talk of potential coalition, one way or the other, who does it help, who does it hurt?
So let's begin by saying you win the election if there's a parliament that supports your government.
Yes.
That's victory. Everything else is defeat. If you get elected with a set of seats that you go to parliament and you cannot command a majority, then you lose whatever the numbers are. This isn't an American presidential system where if you squeak out a plurality in the Electoral College, even though you lose the vote, that somehow you get to govern for 4 years. This is a parliamentary system. In parliamentary system, we elect a parliament, and a parliament elects the government. So those are the stakes. And as to who this helps, I think that a lot of progressive people were pretty disappointed with the Trudeau government. You can debate the issues, but that is a reality, as we can see from the polls. And so Jagmeet Singh is saying, you can get a progressive government by voting NDP, and then you'll be sure to get one. And in our universe, in our world, that's a pretty compelling argument.
Is it?
Do
you think it will work? That's what I'm most curious about.
I think what it does is it's a good just in terms of a campaign tactic for a weekend. I think that what it does is it is a good answer to the Liberal argument that you have to vote Liberal or you get the Tory. And basically what to Democrat voters, what you're saying is actually that's not true. You can get a parliament that will put together a progressive government that will actually be progressive instead of the old game of signaling left and turning right that some would argue we've seen in the last 4 years.
I want to follow up with you and both of you actually, because you've been inside a party when you're at the point of what's going to happen after Election Day. We've won. Well, in your case, Michelle, you had won the most seats, but you had not tested the confidence of the House yet. And then when you eventually did, in BC, you didn't survive that. Yeah. What is it like on the other end of that?
Well, so I've been through it twice now, right? In 2004 we won the most seats, and Mr. Martin went and formed a government, and we worked kind of issue by issue and vote by vote with the NDP for a certain amount of time, and governed for about 2 years or a year and a half. And then there's the other side where you kind of have a feeling if you're going to be successful or not. But we wanted to try. We wanted to show, in that case, we wanted to show British Columbians that we respected the vote that they actually had put in the ballot box, and that we were going to do our best to try and govern it that way. Turned out that the opposition came together and voted us down. And I guess the one thing I would say is that I think that everybody should be focused in, and my advice certainly to a leader would be focus on the ballots, focus on getting people to the ballot box. Don't be talking about the machinations of what might happen or after an election or anything like that. You have to respect what Canadians decide to do, make them want to vote for you. And that's the closing argument that I would suggest that our leaders, and certainly that Mr. Trudeau, has to make over the next 3 days.
David, I want to bring you in a second. I just want to ask one more question of Brian, and that is around your experience in 2008 negotiating or being part of the negotiations to form a coalition in the opposition. What lessons learned from that experience do you think would inform whatever might happen after this election?
Well, your partners have to want to do it. I mean, our issue, we made a strategic error here in giving an overly prominent role to the Bloc, which gave the Tories their frame. There's a little footnote that's interesting on that. Yeah. And secondly, the Liberal partner that we were trying to work with wasn't sure it wanted to do it. And at the end of the day, as soon as the cannons started firing and we heard the kind of rhetoric that our colleague in Ottawa was using, they cut and run. They toasted their leader and cut and ran. And you have to be ready. As you can see in the British Parliament right now, for example, which is a minority parliament and which is doing some pretty rock and roll stuff. Yeah. You have to have the guts to tough it out, to face tough criticism from your opponents, to insist on what you're doing, and then see if you can win the votes. And our partners are willing to do so. There's a little footnote. They crumpled on the argument, so you're going to form a government with the separatists. And Mr. Harper said that again and again and again, and that was essentially, what I think kind of scared the Liberals off in a way, in addition to their leadership politics. Who is the most likely partner to prop up Mr. Scheer in government if he ends up with the largest number of MPs and this point prevails and he's allowed to test the House? It's most likely the Bloc. And so,
although they both deny that's going to happen.
They both deny it's going to happen.
But it is the question they're being asked.
Tough for the Bloc, because something like 90% of Quebecers are going to vote on Monday to say we don't want a Conservative government. And so how do they then become the facilitators of such a government? But the only other available partner is the Liberals, who on most numbers would end up in official opposition in this scenario. So this is one of the reasons why many people think, unless Mr. Scheer gets a majority, he's not Prime Minister. And maybe he tests the House, maybe he doesn't, but it is hard to see how he survives the day.
Final word to you, David.
Yeah, well, I'd say...
I'm guessing you want to jump in on that point.
Well, no, Brian made a point. I was in Ottawa, too, in 2008 when the coalition attempt happened. It failed because Canadians saw it as democratically illegitimate, right? And they saw it because of the parties that lost an election campaign, conclusively lost election campaign, still felt that they, through some sort of backroom politics, some sort of maneuverings, they could hang on to power. Based on, quite frankly, some antiquated notions. You either win an election or you lose an election. And yes, a government in Canada needs to eventually test the confidence of the Parliament, but who gets to do it should be the winner of an election. And Michelle, with her experience with the Martin government, she didn't mention the 2006 example, because the most recent precedent for what could happen on election night was 2006. Paul Martin lost seats. He had fewer seats than the Conservatives on election night. It was a plurality. Stephen Harper did not win a majority in 2006. Paul Martin could have tried to cook up a backroom scheme to cling on to power. What Paul Martin did was he realized that he had lost the election and he resigned as Prime Minister. That's what you're supposed to do if you lose an election campaign, right? You let the public, get the voters decide. It just depends on what you mean by
supposed, right? Huh? It's custom, it's not convention. I'm out of time, unfortunately. We do have a constitutional expert coming up later in the show to help myself and our viewers understand it. But you're right, it is custom, David, that be the case. It's not, however, a constitutional convention. On that note, I have to end our War Room panel today. But thank you very much to all three of you for your time. Thanks to David Tarrant, Michelle Cadario, and Brian Topp.
How is the Scheer government going to get anything done in a minority situation?
Well, we're going to get a majority government.
In a minority situation, sir. I'd like you to answer that question, if you don't mind.
we're going to get a majority government. What I'm saying is that the party that wins the most seats should be able to form the government. And the other convention in modern Canadian politics is that a prime minister who enters into an election and comes out of that election with fewer seats than another party resigns.
60% of Canadians regularly, consistently vote against the Conservative government or Conservative Party. And so it's wrong for the Conservatives to think that with less than 40% of the power or vote, they deserve all the majority of power. That's wrong.
Actually, I expect the Conservatives to support some aspects of our platform.
I am focused on electing a strong, progressive government. The choice Canadians are facing on October 21st is very clear.
Party leaders may all be talking confidently today, but the polls suggest no party will win a majority on Monday, and that's led to a myriad of hypothetical questions about coalitions and testing the confidence of the House of Commons. How are the parties positioning themselves in the face of those questions? Time for the Power Panel to weigh in. Everyone is here with me in Toronto tonight. Tim Murphy of McMill Advantage is right beside me. Hill and Knowlton's Melissa Lantzman next to him. Chief of Government Relations for the University of Toronto and former Saskatchewan Finance Minister Andrew Thompson is here, as well as journalist and host of the Safe Space podcast, Vicky Machama. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
What a pleasure to have you all here with me. And it's been a long time dream of me to talk about Constitution for the next 8 minute dream of mine.
Since first year law school for me.
For you, yeah. I didn't go to law school, so I just dreamed about this as a young girl. Weigh in, if you could. I'll start with you, Tim, on what we're hearing from Mr. Scheer today, and particularly last night in an interview with CTV around the idea that it's modern convention for the party which wins the most seats to be able to have the first crack at forming government.
Yeah, so I don't think there's a convention. I think you've got experience on both sides in Canadian history. I think fundamentally it's a question of political and public legitimacy. You know, when I worked for Paul Martin, we went into the 06 election and ended up about 24 seats behind the Conservatives, which we at the time thought was that's too big a gap for us to be legitimate and say we could find a combination with other parties to govern. And secondly, the likely person we would seek support from was the NDP had just voted to defeat us in the prior parliament. Exactly. So the facts, so it's very, in my view, fact dependent and context dependent. And we've had second place parties govern, right? So I was part of the provincial Liberal government in 1985 as a staffer, where the Liberals were 4 seats behind. The Conservative government had the accord with the NDP and governed very effectively for 2 years, and then had the general election 2 years after that. And so there's experience on both sides. I think it is fundamentally a question of what's legitimate, and I think what you're seeing Andrew Scheer trying to do is narrow the scope of legitimacy by saying, if it's 1 seat, I get a shot at it, but I don't think that's realistic.
What do you think, Melissa, is behind the strategy of and to be fair to politicians, they're being asked by the media. Yeah, we're looking at the polls, but at the same time, they're not backing away from their messaging. What do you think is behind the messaging, for example, from Mr. Scheer when he talks about this idea?
I think that he's putting out there that there's a reasonable expectation from Canadians that the party that gets the most seats governs. And that's been the case in federally for almost 100 years, where the party that got the most seats got the chance to form government, or the person that lost seated government. I do agree with Tim that it is dependent. It's a very different situation when you're 1 or 2 seats. I don't know what the magic number is, but it's very different when you're 20 seats. The point is that we love talking about what's happening on Tuesday when we haven't gotten through Monday yet, and there's a lot of different sort of machinations that could happen. And I hope that war rooms aren't talking about this. I hope they're just getting out their votes.
I feel like maybe they are.
Yeah. Hopefully.
Andrew, Tim brings up an interesting point about, and same with Melissa, around the context, right? So even take the number of seats out of the equation. Say it's within some sort of feeling of legitimate, positioning. Does the situation change in like what we heard from Jagmeet Singh around the willingness of other parties to work together, whereas you didn't have that willingness in 2006? Might it exist this time? And what kind of scenarios do you think that presents on Tuesday?
So I do think the question will be the expectation of the electorate. Do they want this parliament to work or not? And I think that is a really key question that's going to be there. And we've seen this go on the other scenario. If you think back to, and I think this is what Andrew Scheer is setting up, is that he wants this right to govern. for a period of time, set it up like Diefenbaker, set it up like, well, hopefully, I'm sure he's not wanting to set it up like Joe Clark. But there is that kind of sense that if you get 6 or 8 months under your belt, you're the Prime Minister, you're the big man who goes into the election, you've got something else to sell. I think that that's what Andrew Scheer's strategy is. The problem is that that's not what Canadians are apparently going to vote for. And I think that that's what we need to remember. They're going to go and vote for members of Parliament. They expect the members of Parliament to go and make this Parliament work. Most are not going to vote for that Conservative option. And I think that this is where there is going to be some debate as to kind of how that works. Personally, I think that the NDP's made a mistake in talking about setting up a coalition.
Oh, really?
I
Why?
think that that is an overreach, and I think it's something that's unfamiliar to Canadians. The idea of doing this confidence and supply agreement, I think would be a much better approach for them to work on, and that may be where they in fact move their way back to. I served in a coalition government with the Liberals in Saskatchewan. They aren't unknown in Canada, but they are certainly difficult beasts to kind of work your way through. So we'll see what comes out. I agree with Melissa. Let's let Canadians do their thing on Monday, and then
We'll
we
be
can
back on
we
Tuesday.
can get back to our
We
thing on
will, yeah.
Tuesday. So.
Do you think, Vicky, that the talk of all of this is impacting the level to which strategic voting is factoring into the decisions Canadians are making right now?
I think we're seeing Canadians are already making a set of strategic choices insofar as we've got a 30% increase in voter turnout. So Canadians have seen the election and have already made a set of choices, and that's a good chunk of them. The rest are going to make the rest of their decisions on Monday. And so then this is when this question of a minority or a coalition comes into play. For the remaining voters who have not yet already voted, or for those for whom this election has been wholly disinteresting, this might be the moment that either gets them going again. But again, it's really hard to get people to the ballot box when the question is, what do you think is going to happen? And we as experts have to say, well, a couple hundred years ago, the British started with this process, and now here we are. So I think there's a bit of an opaqueness to it, but at the same time, this might be the thing that gets more people out, the notion that the politicians are going to have to work harder together.
Do you think that's true? Do you think it might motivate some people, one way or the other?
It might actually, because I think part of the game that's being played right now in the way politicians are talking about this is obviously to have some strategic effect around the people who will either vote for them or not vote for someone else. And I was you saw Andrew Scheer today or last 36 hours talk about a majority. And I was really confused about why he would even talk about that in this context. And it may be that what he's trying to do is create a strategic context where NDP voters are thinking about voting strategically might say, okay, well, if they're going to win anyway, maybe I'll stay with the NDP. I think it's so unreal a prospect given everything we're seeing in the polling. I thought it was a strange strategy. And I think the more normal response for politicians is to frame the positive choice. We're working hard and not to take Tuesday for granted, but to get through Monday, which is Melissa's point.
That's kind of Vicky's point. I think
Yeah.
I agree with that people aren't likely going to the ballot box going, oh, what kind of a coalition do I want, and how do we want to set this thing up, and how do the parties align? I think they are going really to go and make choices about what kind of a Canada they want.
I think the interesting point is you're right. I don't think there's much to strategic voting. I think it's a very difficult thing to explain. I think it's a very difficult thing to understand, and certainly one that is hard to poll on. What I do think is that we're having this conversation because there isn't a ballot question, or at least there isn't one ballot question. There might be different ballot questions depending on where you are in Canada, sort of that regional breakdown, but there isn't one thing. We're having an election really because it's been 4 years, and we're due for an election.
Right. Vicky, last word to you.
I mean, I think it's really interesting that we've come up with this. The Conservatives and the Liberals are fairly tied, or really, really close, and then the NDP, the Greens, and the Bloc stand in a position to possibly be kingmakers. What it reminds me of is that Justin Trudeau said that the last election would be the last election under first past the post. Ironically, the Canadians are making choices that are saying to him, well, you didn't do electoral reform, so we're going to do it for you. And so they've set up that choice that in a very different political system would have come up with very different circumstances and different solutions.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.